and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Let's have a look at 2001's Tomb Raider film. We've had the reboot this year with Alicia Vikander that was probably underperformed really at the box office, but I'd imagine by the time all computations are worked, it would have made a little bit of money for Warner Brothers and GK Films that backed that particular project. The new Tomb Raider film leaves it very, very open for a sequel. Whether there'll be one, I don't know. There certainly was a sequel to the original, though. Now, the 2001 Tomb Raider film starred Angelina Jolie, but the genesis of that came back to the launch of the original video game in the mid-1990s. Now, Tomb Raider, the game, which also introduced the character of Lara Croft, was first released in 1996. It was put together by Core Design that had been acquired by Eidos, and they knew they had something special, and they knew they had something cinematic. I mean, the Indiana Jones influences are all over the Tomb Raider, games, and continue to be so to this day, even though they've found more direction of their own as well. Now, the movie rights inevitably became a bit of a hot property, and after a fairly fierce fight, Core Design and Eidos did a deal with producer Lawrence Gordon and Paramount Pictures. Paramount Pictures at the time, headed up by Sherry Lansing, but Core and Eidos were in a real position of power on this one, and they didn't want to sign over their rights to their biggest property, and have the project languishing around the studio and going through development hell and left unmade. And so they put a clause into the contract that they inked that Paramount signed up for, and the clause was this: if no work was done by the studio on a Tomb Raider film for 45 days, the option to make that film would be lost and the rights would revert. They would just lose the option altogether, and Paramount thus had to move fast. And this is very much against the approach of Sherry Lansing, just to move forward on such a very, very big production at such a breakneck speed. Before we get too deep into it, let's just have a little reminder of the film with this clip. Again, copyright Paramount Pictures, who, if their lawyers are listening to this podcast, please be assured that I will tell everybody that all these films I'm talking about are available on disc, which I have just done. Here's that clip.
Angelina Jolie.
Is Lara Croft.
Time to save the universe?
Absolutely.
Tomb Raider.
So then, Paramount had its rights. It knew it had a blockbuster. Core and Eidos were planning lots of sequels to the Tomb Raider games, which would go on to be hugely successful for a while, until roughly around the fourth one, I think, where things started to turn a little. But it needed a director. And it needed writers, and in the end, scripts were commissioned, and lots of writers had a try. There's a guy called Brett V. Friedman who penned Mortal Kombat Annihilation. He had a screenplay put together that wasn't used. Die Hard and Street Fighter Stephen E. D'Souza, a really famed writer of the 80s and 90s, in particular of movies, he put together a draft, and it was said that by the time we got to 1999, 11 different writers at least had given the screenplay a shot. This is not unusual. What was unusual was the pace that Paramount was having to work at, that it just couldn't sit and think and have a 2-month time out. Those rights would just disappear altogether. What moved it forward in the end was hiring that director. Now, Simon West had sprung to prominence in movie terms by teaming up with Don Simpson and Jerry Bruckheimer to direct Con Air. A huge amount of affection for Con Air. Maybe we'll come to that in a future podcast. But for his next movie, he had signed up with Paramount to direct the thriller The General's Daughter, which starred John Travolta. Now, The General's Daughter was a good hit. I mean, it came out in the late summer of 1999. It got middling reviews, but made money for Paramount. And West, by this stage, with 2 hit films under his belt, he was looking for something a little bit different to do. He'd done an action film and he'd done a thriller, but now he felt comfortable. Now he'd scratched that itch with The General's Order. Now he felt comfortable taking on a big movie again. And his wish to do a big movie coincided with the fact that Paramount had one that needed making. It didn't have a finished script at this stage, but it signed the deal with West, and West was the director of the Tomb Raider film, and he had to move quickly because the same pressures were heavily on him. And he came aboard and he went through the collection of drafts that had been produced, and I think there's a really good book about Sherry Lansing's time at Paramount called Leading Lady, Sherry Lansing and the Making of a Hollywood Groundbreaker, and Stephen E. D'Souza is quoted in that book about how West came in and pretty much threw everything out. The quote is, he comes in and almost immediately says, "This script is shit," even though at that point the script that he's talking about had been budget and scheduled approved. It was nearly ready to go. So West then comes in and he hires more writers. 4 or 5 more drafts are done. At the end of that particular process, West didn't like any of those either, and so he pens it. And he would get one of the writing credits on the final film. For West, he was frustrated by this process. It was no better, it was no happier for him. He was looking to prepare his movie. He was looking to do the pre-production work ahead of what was quite a taxing physical production that he had coming up. But as West would recall, the risk of losing the rights meant there was no time just to stop and think. Everything had to move. Those 45 days were just ticking on. If they didn't move in those 45 days, the rights would go, the Tomb Raider film would be over. Now, happening in the background of all of this, Lansing was and Paramount were brokering a series of deals that would mitigate the cost of the film somewhat. Various tax breaks. So, for instance, sequences of the film shot in the UK. Now, this was at the point where the UK had finally, in the 1990s, started offering tax breaks that encouraged Hollywood productions back. I mean, it was quite a taxing time for a while in the UK, but I think it was Saving Private Ryan was in Ireland and the UK, if memory serves, and a growing number of big Hollywood productions were now interested in shooting in Britain, and Tomb Raider was one of them. Angelina Jolie was cast in the role of Lara Croft. She had the 6 months of training that she needed to do to get going, and the film got shooting, and it appears fairly clear. I mean, most reports seem to say this, that by the time of the first preview screening, people knew that they didn't have a classic on their hands. The need to actually make the film, in this case, with respect to the director and writers who were doing the best with the situation they had, but the need to hit that deadline was above all else the most important thing. And Lansing has talked in the aforementioned book about when she sat in the first screening of the movie, the first preview screening, and she says, "It was terrible. I was in this screening room, I was so disappointed. It was well shot and well acted, but it was completely disjointed, and the story made no sense." Now, there was only so much by this stage that could be fixed. More shooting was greenlit and funded, so another week before the cameras. Stuart Baird, who a legendary editor who also directed films like Executive Decision, Star Trek Nemesis, he came in late in the day to try and just fix some of the problems with the film and give it a re-editing. But there was only so much that could be worked with. But the one thing Lansing absolutely knew she could do, and the one thing Paramount was excellent at, was selling a film, that it could package together the movie and get a return and effectively aim for a better sequel. It wasn't really Lansing's way. Lansing was very film driven, loved movies and still loves movies, and the idea of packaging out something that wasn't brilliant but just taking the money wasn't really her. But that's what Paramount had to do. And she said she's quoted again in the book, "I don't have a clue what the movie's about. I can still sell it. You can spend all this money to improve the picture, but it won't make the tiniest difference to how much it brings in." And so it proved to be. And the huge marketing campaign tied with the profile of the character of Lara Croft at the time, the games were still going, and the film arrives in 2001, and the reviews were irrelevant. And we talk a lot about that now, about how that everything's on the first weekend and how a review isn't necessarily the make or break, and to a point nor has it ever have been, but reviews certainly in the past have been able in some instances to break a film and more positively to be able to hoist a film on their shoulders and really give it a profile. In the case of Tomb Raider, it just didn't matter. The film grossed $275 million worldwide. It cost Paramount, thanks to those tax breaks, less than $100 million to make, and so again we come back to $275 million at this stage was a lot more money than we would consider it now. And of course this was at the point the film came out as well, at the point the DVD was booming as well. So the home release earned Paramount another hefty part. I think it's Kevin Smith who said for a long time that the theatrical release is the trailer for the DVD release, which is where you make the most money. And in the case of Tomb Raider, Paramount had a very, very successful movie on its hands, just not one that people particularly loved. That said, it would Simon West wouldn't return to do the sequel, The Cradle of Life. That went to Jean de Bon, who was hot off the back of Speed and Twister is another one I've got lined up for this podcast. But in the case of the 2001 Tomb Raider, there was just a feeling that Paramount got away with it. Ironically, the new Tomb Raider film, and I spoke to Mark Kermode coming out of a screening of that, and I agree with what he said, which is it's as good as anything like that could be. And I think, yeah, that's probably about right. But that one is regarded as a less successful film, in spite, in my view at least, of being an awful lot better. I don't think any of them are perfect, but the more recent one is as good as it got. That then has been the first episode of Film Stories. What I would hugely appreciate is if you have enjoyed this, because this is a whole new thing for me, if you have enjoyed this, if you could leave a review, if you could tell your friends, if you could just spread the word. I personally, I love stories like this, and I love telling stories like this and hearing stories like this. And if I can get to the point of this podcast being a home where it doesn't have to be a classic movie, it doesn't have to be a revered movie, it can just be a fun movie, the kind that we don't often hear the behind the scenes stories are. If this podcast can be a home for that, that is my ultimate aim of it. I'll need your help to get there. Thanks very much for listening. Take care, and if all goes to plan, I'll see you next time.